One game, three timelines, infinite consequences. For decades, Zelda fans have debated, theorized, and argued about how Ocarina of Time fractured the entire Zelda timeline into separate realities. But the real reason Nintendo created this split? It's not what most players think. The answer lies buried in the game's ending, in ancient Hylian prophecy, and in a design choice that changed gaming history forever. Let's get one thing straight right now. Ocarina of Time didn't just tell a story about time travel, it created a temporal paradox so profound that Nintendo had to officially acknowledge three separate timelines spawning from a single game: the child timeline, the adult timeline, and the fallen hero timeline. Each one represents a completely different reality, a different version of Hyrule's future, all because of what happens during Link's battle with Ganondorf. But here's what makes this absolutely mind-blowing. Nintendo didn't plan this as a trilogy of timelines from the beginning. The timeline split emerged organically from the game's ending, and it took Nintendo 13 years to officially confirm what fans had suspected all along. In 2011, the Hyrule Historia finally laid it all out, the official timeline showing how one hero's journey created three divergent histories. So what actually causes these timeline splits? Why does Ocarina of Time become the nexus point for the entire Zelda franchise? The answer starts with something that seems simple but carries cosmic implications: the Triforce itself. The Triforce isn't just a magical artifact or a MacGuffin for heroes to chase. According to the game's opening prologue narrated over the creation myth, the Triforce was left behind by the three golden goddesses, Din, Nehru, and Furore, after they created the land of Hyrule, the heavens, and all life. This sacred relic grants the wishes of whoever touches it. But here's the critical detail that most players overlook. It only grants a pure wish if the heart of the one who touches it holds power, wisdom, and courage in perfect balance. When someone with an unbalanced heart touches the Triforce, it splits. The piece that best represents their dominant trait stays with them, while the other two pieces seek out hosts who embody those qualities. This is exactly what happens when Ganondorf enters the sacred realm and touches the Triforce. His heart craves power above all else, so the Triforce fractures. He receives the Triforce of power, while the Triforce of wisdom goes to Zelda, and the Triforce of courage goes to Link. This split creates the fundamental conflict of Ocarina of Time, but it also sets up something far more significant: the vulnerability that allows timeline branching to occur. See, when the Triforce is whole and unified, it represents absolute divine authority. When it's split across three individuals locked in conflict, reality itself becomes unstable, malleable, susceptible to temporal manipulation. Think about it. Throughout Ocarina of Time, Link uses the Ocarina of Time, the royal family's sacred instrument capable of manipulating the flow of time itself, to jump between child and adult eras, to warp to different locations, to change day into night. Every time Link plays one of these temporal songs, he's bending reality. And when reality is already destabilized by a fractured Triforce held by three people in direct opposition, those temporal manipulations have consequences that ripple across multiple possible futures. Now here's where the timeline truly fractures, at the moment of final confrontation. When Link faces Ganondorf at the top of his tower, three potential outcomes exist, not just as gameplay possibilities, but as actual branching realities acknowledged by Nintendo in the official timeline. The first and darkest timeline, the Fallen Hero timeline, occurs if Link actually loses the final battle. This isn't some theoretical what-if scenario. This is an official branch of the Zelda timeline where the hero of time falls to Ganondorf and the King of Evil claims the complete Triforce. Wait, doesn't that seem impossible? Players who beat Ocarina of Time obviously defeated Ganondorf, so how can there be a timeline where Link loses? This is the paradox that confused fans for years, until Hyrule Historia clarified it. The Fallen Hero timeline represents a quantum possibility, a parallel reality where despite everything Link accomplished, despite awakening all seven sages, despite wielding the Master Sword, Ganondorf still emerged victorious in their final confrontation.
The implications are devastating. In this timeline, Ganondorf obtains all three pieces of the Triforce, becoming nearly unstoppable. The seven sages, having lost their champion, are forced to make a desperate last stand. They manage to seal Ganondorf in the Sacred Realm, transforming it into the Dark World, but they cannot defeat him completely. This timeline leads directly to a link to the past, where generations later, Ganon, now fully transformed into his beast form, rules the Dark World while corrupting Hyrule from within. This fallen hero timeline contains some of the darkest games in the Zelda series. A Link to the Past shows a Hyrule where Ganon's influence has corrupted the land for generations. Link's Awakening follows a different hero who's so traumatized by his adventures that his mind creates an entire dream world. Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages show followers of Ganon attempting to resurrect him through sacrificial rituals. The original Legend of Zelda and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link depict a Hyrule so broken that the kingdom has fragmented into isolated territories, with knowledge of ancient magic nearly lost. But what's crucial to understand is why this timeline exists as an official branch. Nintendo included it because the concept of the hero's potential failure is fundamental to the Zelda series' narrative DNA. From the very first game, players could fail, could get game over, could watch Link die. The Fallen Hero timeline acknowledges that those failures aren't just gameplay mechanics, they're narrative possibilities that, in a quantum sense, create their own reality. Now let's shift to the timelines where Link actually succeeds, because this is where things get truly complex. When Link defeats Ganondorf and the Seven Sages seal him away, the hero has saved the adult era. Hyrule is freed from 7 years of Ganondorf's dark rule. But here's the problem that creates the second major timeline split. Link doesn't belong in this era. Remember, Link was sealed in the Sacred Realm for 7 years because he was too young to wield the Master Sword properly. He's not a natural adult. He's a child artificially aged and suspended in time. His childhood was stolen, his friends have grown without him, and the world he saved is not the world he remembers. This is heartbreaking from a character perspective, but it's also temporally unstable. Princess Zelda recognizes this injustice and makes a monumental decision. She uses her power as the bearer of the Triforce of Wisdom to send Link back to his childhood. Not just back to the moment before the final battle, but all the way back to before he opened the Door of Time, before he pulled the Master Sword, before his childhood was taken. This creates the adult timeline, the reality where Link vanished after defeating Ganondorf. In this timeline, the adult Link literally disappears from existence, returned to the past. Hyrule continues forward without its hero, and while Ganondorf remains sealed for a time, the consequences of Link's absence become catastrophic. The adult timeline is the strangest and most tragic of the 3 branches. Without Link, when Ganondorf eventually breaks free from his seal, and the Zelda series makes clear that seals always eventually weaken, there's no hero of time to stop him. The people pray for the legendary hero to return, but he never comes because he's living in a completely different timeline. The goddesses themselves are forced to intervene. According to the prologue of The Wind Waker, the first game in the adult timeline after Ocarina, the golden goddesses flood the entire world. Not a partial flood or a regional disaster, the entire kingdom of Hyrule is submerged beneath a vast ocean, freezing the kingdom and Ganondorf in time beneath the waves. This is divine judgment on a scale unprecedented in the Zelda series. The goddesses essentially hit the reset button on Hyrule, preserving it in stasis underwater while allowing survivors to establish new lives on mountaintops that became islands. The Wind Waker takes place on this great sea, where the legend of Hyrule has faded into myth, where most people don't even know their islands were once mountaintops, where a new hero, not Link Reborn, but a completely different boy who happens to wear green, must prove himself without the weight of prophecy. The adult timeline continues through Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, showing a world that has completely moved beyond ancient Hyrule. By Spirit Tracks, Hyrule has been refounded in a new land, with trains and industrial development replacing the medieval fantasy aesthetic. It's a timeline that shows what happens when the traditional cycle of hero, princess, and demon king is broken. But the real mindbender is the child timeline, the reality Link returns when Zelda sends him back. This is where the timeline mechanics get philosophically complex, because Link returns with knowledge of a future that will now never happen.
Think about what this means. Child Link has memories of the adult era, memories of frozen Zora's Domain, of Castletown in ruins, of Sage's awakening, of defeating Ganondorf. But none of those events have occurred yet in the timeline he's returned to. He's created a temporal paradox where knowledge from a prevented future exists in the mind of a child who hasn't experienced it. What does Link do with this knowledge? According to Majora's Mask, which takes place in the child timeline shortly after Ocarina, Link leaves Hyrule searching for Navi, his fairy companion who departed after Ganondorf's defeat. But the game's opening text crawl reveals something crucial. Link carries warnings about Ganondorf that he presumably delivered to the royal family before leaving. This explains why the child timeline diverges so dramatically from the adult era. Armed with Link's warnings, Zelda and the royal family act before Ganondorf can betray them and enter the sacred realm. The exact details aren't shown in any game, but Twilight Princess, which occurs in the child timeline a century after Ocarina, reveals the outcome. In Twilight Princess, players learn that Ganondorf was captured and sentenced to execution. The game shows a flashback where the sages attempt to execute Ganondorf using the Mirror of Twilight, but he survives due to the Triforce of power that he still possessed. Wait, how does he have the Triforce of power in this timeline? This is one of the most debated aspects of the child timeline. In the adult era, the Triforce split when Ganondorf touched it, but Link returned to childhood before those events occurred, meaning the Triforce should still be whole in the Sacred Realm. So why does Ganondorf possess the Triforce of power in Twilight Princess? The most commonly accepted explanation, supported by Hyrule Historia, is that the Triforce split in the child timeline occurred the same way it did in the adult timeline, but earlier in the sequence of events. When Link warned Zelda about Ganondorf and the royal family moved to arrest him, his heart's ambition was so strong that the Triforce resonated and split, granting him power even as his physical body was captured. This creates fascinating narrative symmetry. In all three timelines, the Triforce splits the same way. Ganondorf gets power, Zelda gets wisdom, Link gets courage. The Divine Triangle's fragmentation is a constant across realities, suggesting it's not just a game mechanic, but a cosmic inevitability written into the fabric of destiny itself. The child timeline continues through Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and Four Swords Adventures. Each game shows a Hyrule that developed differently because Link prevented Ganondorf's 7-year reign. There's no destroyed Castletown, no frozen Zora's Domain, no Gerudo military expansion. Instead, Hyrule experiences different threats: Skull Kid wearing Majora's Mask, the Twilight Invasion, a reborn Ganon leading the Gerudo in open war. What makes the child timeline particularly interesting is how it deals with Link's sacrifice. He gave up his adult life, his achievements, his friendships with the awakened sages, all to prevent a dark future. But does anyone even know he did this? In Majora's Mask, Link is just a child wandering lost in the woods. The grand hero who saved Hyrule in the adult timeline doesn't exist as far as most people know. This raises profound questions about heroism and sacrifice. If saving the world means erasing the version of yourself that saved it, are you truly a hero? If preventing a tragedy means only you remember that tragedy was even possible, does it still count as salvation? The child timeline suggests that the truest heroism requires giving up recognition, glory, and even your own existence in a very real sense. Now here's where the timeline mechanics get really interesting: the role of prophecy and destiny across all three branches. Throughout the Zelda series, characters reference ancient prophecies, the legend of the hero of time, predictions about reincarnation and eternal cycles. How do these prophecies work if the timeline has split into three separate realities? The answer seems to be that prophecy in the Zelda universe is probabilistic rather than deterministic.
The ancient Hylians who wrote prophecies weren't seeing one fixed future. They were seeing the pattern, the archetypal cycle of hero, princess, and demon king that repeats across timelines. Each timeline fulfills the prophecies differently, but the core pattern remains. In the Fallen Hero timeline, prophecy manifests as the eternal cycle of Ganon's defeat and resurrection across multiple generations of Links. In the adult timeline, prophecy breaks down entirely. The hero stops coming, forcing divine intervention and a new type of heroism without destiny. In the child timeline, prophecy becomes about warning and prevention rather than reaction.
This makes Ocarina of Time's ending even more significant. When Zelda sends Link back in time, she's not just fixing a personal injustice. She's fundamentally altering how prophecy and destiny function in one branch of reality. She's proving that the future isn't fixed, that knowledge from one timeline can change another, that free will exists even within cyclical destiny. The musical and thematic motifs that recur across timelines reinforce these connections. The Song of Time, taught to Link by Princess Zelda in Ocarina, represents temporal manipulation and appears in various forms across multiple games and timelines. Zelda's lullaby signifies the royal family and divine providence. Ganon's theme conveys the persistence of evil across ages and realities. But these motifs don't just repeat, they evolve based on each timeline's specific history. In the Wind Waker's adult timeline, ancient Hylian has become a lost language, and songs from Ocarina are remembered only as melodies without meaning. In Twilight Princess's child timeline, the Temple of Time has become a sacred ruin, a monument to events most people don't remember. These variations show how each timeline develops its own cultural memory, its own interpretation of shared history. Items and artifacts also carry different significance across timelines. The Master Sword exists in all three branches, but its role shifts dramatically. In the Fallen Hero timeline, it's repeatedly recovered and lost across generations. In the adult timeline, it rests in Ganondorf's head at the bottom of the ocean for centuries. In the child timeline, it remains in the Temple of Time's sacred grove, waiting for a crisis that will be different from the one it was originally drawn to prevent. The Seven Sages represent another fascinating cross-timeline element. In the adult era of Ocarina, specific individuals awaken as sages: Saria, Darunia, Ruto, Impa, Naboru, and Rauru, plus Zelda as the seventh. But when Link returns to childhood, these awakenings never happen in that timeline. So who are the sages in the child timeline? Twilight Princess shows a completely different group, ancient sages who existed before Ocarina's events. This reveals something crucial about the sage role. It's not tied to specific individuals, but to positions of spiritual authority that can be filled different ways depending on timeline. The sages who appear in Twilight Princess's flashback are unnamed and faceless, suggesting that the sage role is archetypal rather than personal. The timeline split literally changed who becomes a sage, not just when they awaken. Fan theories about the timeline have evolved tremendously since Hyrule Historia's official release in 2011. Before that book, the Zelda community was divided into dozens of competing timeline theories. Some fans arranged games chronologically by release date. Others tried to create a single unified timeline. A few theorized multiple timelines but couldn't agree on how many or how they split. The revelation of 3 timelines, particularly the Fallen Hero timeline, shocked many fans. The idea that Link's potential defeat created an entire branch of reality seemed to contradict the heroic narrative, but it also validated something players had felt all along, that failure in Zelda games carried narrative weight, that game overs weren't just mechanical resets, but acknowledgments of possibility. Since Hyrule Historia, fan theories have shifted to questions the book didn't fully answer. Where exactly does Breath of the Wild fit in the timeline? It includes elements from all 3 branches, the Rito from the adult timeline, locations from the child timeline, and mentions of Ganon's repeated revivals from the Fallen Hero timeline. Nintendo has been deliberately vague about Breath of the Wild's placement, with developers suggesting it takes place so far in the future that the timelines might have reconverged.
This brings us to the most compelling theory currently circulating in the Zelda community, the timeline convergence theory. This proposes that the three timelines, split at Ocarina, eventually merge back together in the distant past of Breath of the Wild. Evidence includes the presence of locations and artifacts from all timeline branches, references to all major games regardless of timeline, and statements from developers about wanting to move beyond timeline restrictions. Whether this theory proves true in future games remains to be seen, but it represents the evolution of fan engagement with Zelda lore. Players aren't passive consumers anymore. They're active theorists, building frameworks to understand narrative continuity across 30-plus games spanning multiple realities. But here's the ultimate question. Why does any of this matter in 2026, 28 years after Ocarina of Time's original release? Why do fans still debate timeline placement, Triforce mechanics, and the consequences of time travel?
The answer is that Ocarina of Time created something unprecedented in gaming, a narrative framework where player choice, multiple playthroughs, and different outcomes aren't just gameplay variations, but canonical realities. Every player who experienced a game over against Ganondorf participated in the fallen hero timeline's creation. Every player who completed the game and saw Link return to childhood witnessed the child timeline's birth. Every player who thought about what happened in the adult world after Link left considered the adult timeline's tragedy. Ocarina of Time validated player experience as narratively significant. It said that the different ways people interact with a game, the different outcomes they achieve, the different emotional connections they form, all of this matters and creates real, distinct realities within the game's universe. This is why the timeline splits resonate so powerfully. They're not just lore complications or franchise housekeeping. They're acknowledgement that games exist in dialogue with players, that the act of playing creates meaning, that different experiences of the same story produce different truths. Modern game developers have recognized this power. Games like The Witcher 3, Detroit Become Human, and The Stanley Parable embrace branching narratives and multiple endings as core features. But Ocarina of Time did something bolder. It made those branches canonical history for an entire franchise spanning decades. The timeline splits also demonstrate Nintendo's commitment to continuity even when it creates complexity. It would have been easier to declare each Zelda game standalone, to ignore connections between titles, to avoid the timeline headache entirely. Instead, Nintendo embraced the complexity, published official timeline documentation, and turned what could have been a continuity problem into the series' most compelling meta-narrative. Looking forward, the timeline splits will continue influencing Zelda games. Whether future titles explore specific timeline branches, attempt convergence, or create new temporal mechanics entirely, they'll be building on the foundation Ocarina established, that time in the Zelda universe isn't linear, that destiny isn't fixed, and that heroes make choices with cosmic consequences. The genius of Ocarina of Time's timeline splits is that they turn a single game into a lens through which the entire franchise can be understood. Every Zelda game before Ocarina can be mapped to post-Ocarina timelines. Every game after Ocarina exists because of choices made during Ocarina. One adventure becomes the axis point for dozens of adventures across multiple realities. And perhaps most importantly, the timeline splits preserve the thematic core of the Zelda series while allowing infinite variation. The cycle of hero, princess, and demon king repeats, but never exactly the same way. Evil returns, but through different mechanisms. Courage triumphs, but at different costs. The pattern persists across timelines while the specifics shift, creating familiarity and novelty in perfect balance. So, is this why Ocarina of Time's timelines shifted? Absolutely. The splits emerged from a combination of narrative ambition, gameplay mechanics, and Nintendo's willingness to embrace complexity over simplicity. They transformed one ending into 3 destinies, one hero's journey into infinite possibilities, and one game into the cornerstone of the most intricate continuity in gaming history. The three timelines aren't a bug or an accident or a retcon. They're the feature. They're proof that Ocarina of Time was never just a game about time travel. It was a game about choices, consequences, sacrifice, and the weight of heroism across multiple realities. And that's why, nearly 37 years later, fans still debate, theorize, and explore every implication of that single moment when Zelda sent Link back to reclaim his stolen childhood, unknowingly fracturing destiny itself into three divergent paths through time.